Hi, welcome to Up Your Nerd Cred. Did you used to know everything that was happening in the Marvel and DC universes? Did finding out that some superheroes are from Marvel and some are from DC blow your mind? Has keeping track of everything that's happening there and then realizing that we're only talking about the comics universes, not the cinematic ones, and the different universes with their own multiversal crises have gotten a little bit out of hand? Well, don't worry. Up Your Nerd Cred is here to talk about the gods cosplaying as men, the men cosplaying as gods, and how much the cinematic universes are really leaving out. At the end of each episode, you'll hopefully know a little bit more than you did and can up your nerd cred. I'm your casual nerd host, CiCi. My kid has gotten into Curious George, and it's super cute as a show, but my dad is quick to remind everyone that since he has no tail and a chimpanzee face, Curious George is actually an ape, not a monkey. He is not a curious little monkey. I have no idea where my pedantry came from. No clue whatsoever. Anyway, this is technically, while we're doing that, a casual episode. Our expert nerd is busy studying the tomes of lore, recovering from the number of Cyber Week sale ads he's gotten. Who's to say? So, since he's not here, I'll ask you directly, what are we nerding out about this week? Now, just a reminder, listeners, you can nerd out about all kinds of things, okay? It does not just have to be heroes and villains, okay? Sabrina Carpenter told the White House to not use her music immediately, and it drew comparisons to another blonde pop star, the notoriously litigious one. Said pop star not demanding the White House cease using her music on their official Instagram posts. Interesting. Also, Hanukkah is December 14th to 22nd this year. Please do not wish your Jewish friends a happy Hanukkah on December 25th. Please. Oh, also, when the Secretary of Defense has fun typos in his name tag, it's super hard to believe that it's not on purpose. Just saying that. So, what am I nerding out about? Look, I'm not gonna lie. My Marvel year-on-year book, okay, was an amazing impulse buy. But it is not good for Marvel Tome to be alone. So guess what? I got the DC year by year too! Look, I just got it, which is why it's not already marked up the way the Marvel book was. But look how cool it was. Look at this. Look, it's getting to be the kind of cold where I debate if the possible parking ticket is worth going outside to move the car. And I would much rather read about Wonder Girl's wedding going off without a hitch the month I was born. So I'm actually going to have to take a quick break to go read some more DC history while Beyonce plays in the background. So we'll be right back to Up Your Nerd Cred. Welcome back. Now, podcast listener, it may surprise you to discover that in a past life, I actually was an attorney. Full-on JD. I was actually licensed to practice law on everything. I actually ended up doing it for about 5 years, and it turns out that most law practice is pretty much professional essay writing. Very specific essay writing, where a citation is incorrect if the period isn't italicized, and it's very tedious if the case is uninteresting, or if you have undiagnosed ADHD and you're struggling really hard to manage grad school and working, but you do it twice somehow and end up with a JD MBA, but that is not what this is about. That's not what this is about. Anyway, I left the law. I switched to nonprofit. Right now I'm focusing on my kid. Who knows what'll happen next? Just because you're expecting things to go one way does not mean that it's not going to end up going another way and be actually even more interesting. Now, I tell you that story to say that the episode this week was originally going to be about, realistically speaking, who counts as a god in the DC and Marvel universes, right? So, I mean, like, generally speaking, there's a clause in insurance agreements. It's not there as much anymore, but it essentially was saying that companies weren't going to be liable in the case of acts of God, right? So in our universe, we usually think of acts of God as being things like hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, right? Generally, we're looking at something that is kind of catastrophic without necessarily having a human being that could have been held liable, right? There's no lady who dropped a package that leads to firecrackers going off on a train situation, right? Right. So while those acts of God used to be wholly excluded from insurance coverage, you can now actually get coverage for specific events, although it is much higher in certain places. Florida, climate change is wreaking havoc on your insurance rates. You guys really got to do something about it. Anyway, I thought about doing an episode where I talk about whether Thor or Wonder Woman falling on your car could be an act of God. Like, especially if they fall in their civilian forms, right? Donald Blake or Diana Prince. Or, more importantly, do people in the Marvelverse smudge a little bit of green on their car after an accident to try to get some sort of like Hulk bonus from a villain's civil asset forfeiture victims fund kind of thing? Also, what kind of precedents for intentional infliction of emotional distress are set when reality warpers make changes to the fundamental rules of the universe? Especially if they put things back and some people remember what happened and some people don't, right? Okay, so as much as I joke about how you shouldn't go into law unless you really, really love it, and as you know, one might think that it's very cool and exciting, but often it's probably going to be something more akin to 4 years helping a pharmaceutical company's merger with another pharmaceutical company. Today, we're nerding out about heroes and villains in the courtroom. Now, there's a lot of legal topics that we could cover, but for this casual level episode, we're going to be talking about the kinds of first year / 1L topics that kept me up in general. And by that, I mean all of the topics that we cover in first year, or at least that I covered in my first year of law school. So we're going to start with torts, not delicious pastries or something that deserves a retort. But this is where your civil harms are, okay? So this is where, like, you have assault and battery, right? Those are torts in a civil law way, which are very different from assault and battery in a criminal law kind of way, okay? You, as a standard citizen, you can't criminally charge someone who punches you in the face, right? You would need to file a police report and essentially tell the state that the puncher violated the statutes against punching, right? If you get punched in the face and you want to be compensated for damages, you're going to be suing in civil court. But what happens if you're punched in the face by the state, right? Then you might have neither like a criminal nor civil way of complaining about it because the state has qualified immunity. And unless your civil rights were violated in a way that the state should have known was violating them, you're often SOL. It's why cops being held liable for their abuses is such a notable event. So what happens then legally when Commissioner Gordon shines the bat signal and sicks the Cape Crusader on you? Batman certainly isn't on like GCPD payroll, right? I mean, who is your lawyer really going to go after? Because here's another fun fact about torts. Cops aren't actually allowed to ask private citizens to do things to get around what would be a constitutional violation if the state did it, right? So once somebody, a private citizen, is following the instructions of cops, then said private citizen is converted into being what's considered a state actor, which means they're acting with the power of the state, and the responsibility for their actions bounces to the state because your boss is responsible for what you do, right? It's also worth noting that judges tend to establish tests, essentially, to establish if an alleged action counts as the action that is being questioned, you know? Is this actually a assault? Is this actually a tortious interference with business, right? They act as logic gates, and meeting all of the elements is really the only way for the key of somebody's actions to open the lock of compensation, right? So in the case of figuring out if someone is a state actor, we have what's called the Luger test, right? And so for that one, there's two main elements. The government needs to have given a private citizen some authority to take the actions that are reserved to the state, and then that private citizen use said authority to take an action in furtherance of a state goal. Now, realistically speaking, I can sit here and drop Brennan Lee Mulligan's commentary about how laws are basically a threat from the dominant force, but rather than drop that whole thing, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, one, go look it up, and two, if Commissioner Gordon happened to summon Batman to come and talk to him via a giant skylight with his symbol, the Batman symbol, and Jim just happens to tell his friend Bats about how there's a bunch of people committing crimes over on the docks, and then Batman shortly thereafter is punching those people in the face. They're getting popped in the face by a state actor, right? Even if the cops come later and arrest the criminals after they've been, knocked out. Honestly, I kind of wonder if Wayne Enterprises subsidizes healthcare so much so that Bats doesn't end up getting sued for the ridiculous number of broken bones Hinchman end up with, because honestly, if Gotham becomes liable for his shenanigans, his taxes will skyrocket. Now, torts aren't necessarily just against a person, right? There's all kinds of fun and excitement that comes when you're damaged by the people who sign your paychecks, right? Oscorp not securing their spiders should have led to a lawsuit. Pamela Isley literally has to specifically develop an antidote for her to be able to have any kind of physical intimacy with partners once a workplace accident made her kiss poisonous. Joker and the Flash both had vats of chemicals that clearly were not properly sealed involved in their changes. Honestly, corporate pockets should have absolutely been moving for them, but clearly those corporations lucked out in not getting sued into oblivion. Now, I want to highlight, even if you expect your job to be kind of dangerous, right? There's the kind of dangerous that you can assume some risk on, right? So Ben Grimm told Reed Richards that the shielding on the experimental ship that he'd be piloting wasn't really sufficient, right? But he chose to fly anyway. Although I've got a little side-eye for Reed Richards because he low-key called Ben a coward to get him to fly. Rude, Reed. Rude. Anyway, Ben Grimm, though, was a test pilot. And he'd assumed a certain amount of risk in the past and probably assumed a similar amount of risk for the fateful trip that he took with, the other four. Turning into a relatively immortal, sentient pile of rocks isn't really a risk that Ben could have reasonably assumed, though. Look, it's a good thing that Reed went ahead and covered Ben's expenses without having to be forced by the court. Maybe it's good guy Reed Richards, or maybe it's Reed running the numbers and figuring out that it would actually be way cheaper to just go ahead and take care of his best friend's costs rather than having to deal with attorney's fees. Yeah. There's also something to be said about a person who is working for the government. It is much harder to get the government to volunteer to cover expenses for their fuck-ups. Bruce Banner was running into a nuclear test site to save a teenager who was in the site and shouldn't have been, right? He should have been safe to get that teenager out and back before anything happened. Unfortunately, Igor Drenkov gave the order for the test to continue anyway. Turns out he was a Soviet spy trying to take Banner out, so kablooey. Reasonably speaking, though, if Bruce wanted to sue, he would have a really hard time. Working for the Federales means that he'd probably be seen at the VA, right, for whatever his injuries are. And while he would probably be able to get some money from it, he wouldn't really be able to run the U.S. government's pocket for letting a double agent order the incident, shall we say? Because the U.S. government has what's called sovereign immunity. Basically, it's so cute that you want to sue the government. But if they don't feel like being sued that day, you can't, right? He could try to go after Drenkov, right? Especially since it's very clear that there was malice in his actions. But that's assuming that Igor didn't abscond back to, the USSR before the suit went anywhere. And I can't imagine that the Kremlin would be super hyped to let one of their agents be extradited to stand up in a civil trial in which Bruce Banner was supposed to have died and he didn't. Right? Right. So let's switch gears a little bit because this is getting depressing. I know. Let's talk about contract law and the One More Day storyline. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the storyline, it means two things. One, you are also a casual, and you are welcome here. And two, you should pause this episode and check out, I'm pretty sure that was episode 3, is Tony Stark a father figure or more of a dad bod? But for a very brief reminder, if you don't have time to go and listen to the other episode just yet, Aunt May, Parker's Aunt May, who has had one foot in the grave and another on a banana peel for most of her comics presence, right? She was nearly dying, and Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson decided to trade their marriage to Mephisto so that Aunt May is healthy again. And the fandom has been irritated by this storyline not being retconned for over 20. But also, there's all sorts of contract issues that form whenever you make a deal with a Lord of Hell. Like, okay, generally speaking, he's offering a deal to someone who's in a state of distress, right? Or duress. And okay, he's taking advantage of the fact that his knowledge base and thousands of years of making contracts that are really heavily weighted in his favor are going to work for his favor, right? So for a contract to be valid, there has to be a meeting of the minds, right? Both sides need to have an agreement about what the actions that both parties will be undertaking post-contract, right? Now, it's pretty hard to argue that a person who is trying to save a life is acting under anything but duress, right? And honestly, the fact that Team Parker Watson didn't have legal counsel to help them, fully understand the contract that they were entering into with Mephisto could mean that, if they were able to get him into court on this plane, right, that they could possibly be able to void the contract. I mean, I am not sure where they could reasonably sue, since the Lord of Hell probably has his own version of sovereign immunity. But if Mephisto's contracts are actually with people who are at wildly different levels of sophistication to his own, if he was drawn into court with our own with the rules that we experience here, right? A court could actually, say that a lot of his contracts would be voided. And if there was a court on this plane that could bind his actions, Mephisto would be really, really upset, right? Now, I will also say that the getting to the level of sophistication where a contract with Mephisto could hold up is probably possible. Okay, so Dr. Doom's mom, she is stuck in hell because of how heavily weighted in Mephisto's favor, their contract was, right? Superly Mephisto's favor. But Victor himself probably wouldn't be able to join a class action suit against Mephisto because of the heavily weighted aspects of things, because his level of study and stint as Sorcerer Supreme would probably mean that he would be able to be considered to practice at the same cosmic bar as Mephisto. So, fun and excitement. All right, so we're going to move on from that to civil procedure, right? So here's an interesting moment for the villain on trial. Is it appropriate for Spider-Man or Mysterio to show up to court in their usual costume? I mean, it is what we're used to seeing them in, and they're theoretically in court in their professional capacity. And realistically speaking, it's not like the government is going to be successful at getting a list of super identities to verify that the person on the stand is actually the right one. No. But, I mean, come on. Are you talking to Madeline Pryor, Jean Grey, or a Skrull? If you're pretty sure that it's Eddie Brock Venom who broke your leg, but it turns out that Peter Parker Venom shows up to court, how do you verify that you got the right Venom on the stand? All of this is a problem because you have a constitutional right to face your accuser. And if a super has accused you of a crime, you should be able to know that the person testifying is the super in question. Plus, let's be honest, if a superhero is showing up dressed as a superhero, it's going to be prejudicial as all get out, okay? If Sentry is on the stand, the jury is likely going to treat him as being way more believable than if he's on the stand as Bob or as the Void, right? There's already a credibility bump that cops get when they're on the stand when they testify in uniform. Imagine how many people would be willing to believe that Superman or Wonder Woman were mistaken about your culpability for something when he's wearing the cape, she's carrying the lasso, and you think that they're mistaken? Anyway, if you have that kind of situation in court, that's fine. But what if your attorney is Jennifer Walters, right? She probably has had to jump through all kinds of hoops to be able to prove that she was actually competent to practice law when she was walking around as She-Hulk, right? Think about it. Many variations of Bruce Banner Hulk have had absolutely no capacity to do anything with the multiple PhD level intelligence / memories that Bruce Banner had, right? I mean, it took a lot of time for him to be able to even work to kind of like a kind of hybrid Dr. Hyde setup where Smart Hulk is able to bridge the difference between, Bruce Banner and the Hulk, right? Also, mazel tov to him, good job bridging it. But for Jen, though, there's honestly a range of what it is that I think that she might have had to do, right? It's possible that she was able to just show up to court and have the judges accept that, Marvel versus weird, right? If she wasn't able to convince the state bar that she'd actually retained all of Jennifer's memories and therefore the legal training and licensure, she might have had to retake the bar as She-Hulk. Fingers crossed for her that the board of bar examiners are nice, because you can only take the bar exam at the end of July or the end of February, and the results don't come out for another 3 to 4 months, generally, right? So if she would have to recuse herself anytime that she would switch from Jen to She-Hulk because she would lose her licensure, so many of her opponents in court would try to get her to Hulk out to force a mistrial, right? That's crazy. All right, so I saved the best for last for you. Best is subjective as hell here, though. So if you want to make any attorney that you know groan a little bit, ask them to explain the rule against perpetuities. I mean, it seems super simple, right? No interest in property is valid unless it must vest, if at all, within 21 years after some life and being at the time of creation. So, essentially, anyone who could possibly have a claim to a land property needs to come into existence within 21 years of whichever the death of the person leaving the property is, right? In law school, we talk about the fertile octogenarian having kids very late. Considering the fact that Al Pacino is 83 and his youngest isn't yet 2, it looks like we may have to update it to nonagerian to keep it an edge case. Anyway, Al Pacino's going to leave something to his grandchildren, right? The only way that the baby could have a child to receive part of Al's estate, like the part that the grandchildren are supposed to get, would be if he basically had a teen pregnancy situation, right? Now, is it unfair to the littlest Pacino? Possibly. His children aren't necessarily going to inherit the same way that, like, their cousins would. But holding a portion of his nieces and nephews' inheritance in abeyance until we find out if little Pacino actually decides to go after his dad and have a kid in his 80s, I mean, it means that the land might have a surprise owner kind of out of nowhere. Or even worse, if there is a specific portion of the estate that is apportioned to said hypothetical grandkids, right? And baby Pacino doesn't reproduce for whatever reason, then there's no one who could possibly own the land. The state gets really, really uncomfortable if land doesn't have a clear owner. And the rule against perpetuities is designed to make sure that we don't have land willed that can't be claimed by someone in a relatively reasonable period. 21 years is fairly reasonable. You have a newborn, 21 is when they kind of hit like age of majority, right? What happens if you plan to give Franklin Richards the deed to your house for the rest of his life, and then the property the property would then be donated to the city to become a park afterwards, right? Technically, the city would have an interest in the house and would be able to sue Franklin if he's tearing that house up. But Franklin Richards is canonically going to outlast the entirety of this universe. I don't know how the city is going to be able to turn the property into a park if they have to wait until the next incarnation of the universe to possibly be able to make a claim. Or if you want to be a little more realistic, work with a mortal. Great. John Johns is mortal. Yeah. But he's hundreds of years old, right? He could theoretically have several generations of living descendants whenever he passes, and some of them could get pregnant. Yeah. Ra's al Ghul can't stay dead to save his life, right? Yeah. Imagine that last will and testament. Property lawyers in the superhero universes have very real struggles. Very, very real. So we're going to take a quick break for me to remind myself that Blackacre and Greenacre aren't in the multiverse. They're only in case books, and we'll be back to up your nerd cred. Welcome back to our thrilling conclusion. So, realistically speaking, is being a lawyer in the multiverse a fun and exciting adventure in the whole, like, having edge cases dropped into your lap on a regular basis? Probably. Exciting? Fun? Adventure? Yeesh. What I would like to do, though, is give a shout out to the inspiration for the detour into focusing on the law of superheroes. James Daly and Ryan Davidson, who wrote the book, The Law of Superheroes, right? So now this book was based on the blog, Law and the Multiverse. And let me tell you, it was great for me when I was in law school and actively practicing. They haven't really updated it in a little bit, but if you want to read like a legal take on the Westview anomaly or how tax law would impact heroes, onthemultiverse.com has great takes on all kinds of legal matters in the DC and Marvel multiverses. Instead of thinking about how I was in law school 15-ish years ago, let's look at other calendar events that don't remind your cute, adorable, youthful host that 41 is less than 2 months away. So, 12/6/1983, we actually have the debut of Leech, right? So, he is a young Morlock with the power to negate another mutant's powers. He debuted in Uncanny X-Men number 179 by Chris Claremont, John Romita Jr., and Dan Green. Also, fun fact, Uncanny X-Men number 179 also featured Kitty Pryde's wedding, quote unquote, to the Morlock Caliban. Yes, it's the same episode. Yes, it's the same issue. And we're going to put some respect on both of these situations, right? Right. Also, technically 12/7, Harvey Dent's birthday, but I'm not really sure actually if Two-Face would celebrate it like that. Plus side, if you don't really want to worry about Harvey Dent's birthday, 12/7/2005, Marvel Zombies number 1 by Robert Kirkman and Sean Phillips actually, they picked up a zombie storyline that began in Ultimate Fantastic Four, right? So, there's a lot happening there. Listeners, we've come to the end of our podcast. I know, you're devastated. How could it be over so soon? Well, don't worry. Our next episode will be out next week. And of course, if that's not fast enough, you're welcome to listen to this one again or maybe go into the archives, right? Nerd cred takes time to build. But if for some reason you do decide to go to law school, at least know that the conclusion, issue, rule, analysis, conclusion, CIRAC style of legal writing can be remembered by my first name and middle initial. Do not be me and not realize it until 2 years after law school because they call it IRAC. Yeah. Anyway, we've got an Instagram at Up Your Nerd Cred Pod. I am at CIRACDAVIS, Kiracy Davis. My co-host is at AMDS Art or AMDS_art, depending on the location. We are on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, and we're working on expanding our reach. So if you have a burning question you want us to tackle so you can, up your nerd cred, make sure you like, subscribe, and, leave comments. And if we pick your comments or questions, we'll be sure to shout you out, right? Also, we have launched the Patreon, and while you should definitely follow the link in the show notes to join it, please make sure to also get your friends to like and subscribe to the pod, and your family, and your coworkers who you trust not to be weird about listening to the same podcast as you. And this is where AM usually says to me, good night, everybody.